This is the scene that we see in the very first episode of the series where Ciri, Princess Cirilla, is out. Shit, I turned on Ciri again.
Does it just respond to Ciri?
Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. So with everything that's going on in the world, I hope that all of you are safe and this podcast finds you well. And I hope today's announcements and episode can give you guys a little bit of reprieve and sense of camaraderie as we look ahead to the future. I've got a big exciting announcement for you guys. I created a Discord server for our community, and this is something that I've been wanting to do for so long, and it wasn't until I joined another Discord server that I actually understood how it worked, and I'm excited to bring it to you guys now. We had 40 people join on last night in early access, and they're helping me set up the server. Just between last night and this morning, there have been so many discussions about people getting to know each other, how bad people are at Gwent, people with the same name in the same country connecting. There's opportunities on there to discuss the podcast episodes as they release, and to even talk about things that I'm not going to get to talk about on the show for a couple years. There are so many people out there who ask me all the time, when are you going to get to the games? Not until like 2024, I'm so sorry. But in the meantime, you guys can talk about it on the Discord right now. So if you'd like early access to the Discord and to help me set up that server, fill out our listener survey at bit.ly/listenersurvey2020, and I'd be happy to share the link to the Discord early access as a thank you. If you'd like to wait for the Discord to open, it'll open in a couple weeks, and I'll certainly keep everyone in the loop on social media. So follow Breakfast in Beauclair on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. for those announcements. While we're talking about the community and building it, I'm still looking for people to feature over the break in our Hanza takeover. What that means is an opportunity to share you and your story with the rest of our Breakfast in Beauclair community and on the Breakfast in Beauclair social media channels. If you'd be interested in doing that, I'd love to feature you. All you have to do is head over to bit.ly/thehanza, fill out your name, a picture, and a bunch of random questions about the Witcher universe, and I can't wait for members of the community to meet you all. With all the community stuff that's going on, I'm excited to welcome Katrin to our Hanza on Patreon. For just $1 per episode, receive an on-air shout-out and access to the podcast's entire digital bonus content library on Patreon. Our Patreons also received early access to our Discord server yesterday, with more exclusive Discord benefits to come. Shout out to our producer-level patrons, Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric's the Godling, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B. Julie, Sylvia of Skellige, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, B. Haven of the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, Charlotte from Vangerberg Glamry, Red Kite, the Original Roach, Ariel Kitty, the One True Chef, Dustin, Chris K. of Covier, Libby, the Castel Revello Sommelier, and Claire Odell. If you'd like to explore becoming a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Elora from the Netherlands and Josh C. from the US call in for our discussion of Before a Fall, the 7th episode in Season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher. Join us as we speculate about future seasons of The Witcher on Netflix, talk compelling villains, how to use repetition as a literary device, and we make an early plea for Witcher friends and a D&D DM. The Discord really is looking for a D&D DM or anybody that knows about D&D, so if that's you, please let me know. There's so many people on the Discord who would love to try D&D but never have, so let's make something happen. In our mid-episode news segment, Tidings from Toussaint, Lars from Witcher Flicks shares on-set updates for Season 2 of Netflix's The Witcher. Without further ado, let's get to the discussion for The Witcher, Episode 107, Before a Fall. Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name's Alyssa, and joining us today are Elora from the Netherlands and Josh from the US.
Hello.
Hello.
So this is both of your first times on the show, and I'd love to hear more about who you guys are and introduce you to our hanza.
I'm Elora from the Netherlands. I am a recent art school graduate. I started reading the books after being introduced to the games, and then I searched out everything I could find. So I read the comics, watched the series, and I am now fully up to date and ready to go.
And you're also working on something really incredible right now at the moment, right, Elora? You're working on a fantasy novel?
Yeah, I think about 7 years ago I started on it. I'm getting ready to finish it up, so that's very exciting. There's a lot of editing and a lot of rewriting. The Witcher books are definitely an inspiration for me, so I thought it'd be nice to come on here and talk about those.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about, I guess, the premise of it?
Okay, fun fact. The main character is called Josh, which was an incredible surprise when I saw your email. So, at the start of the story, Josh's hometown is overrun with monsters, and no one knows what they are. No one's ever seen them before. And he feels like he needs to understand them to understand the violence of the attack, to deal with that trauma in some way. There's a reason that they are the way they are, he thinks. And he discovers that their origin is connected with a history that the Elven Council keeps secret as a way to stay in power. On his search he meets Anva, an elf who rebels against the council. She has a tendency for rash decisions, and she also has a father figure who used to be a kind man, but now he's become paranoid and violent, and his people don't trust him anymore. They're joined by Newt, disgraced dwarven researcher, who fights to prove his theories about a power that can change organic life on a molecular level. At its core, the story is about the dangers of guilt and shame and about choosing empathy.
So I know that you talked through a little bit of your inspirations. You said The Witcher was an inspiration for you in working on this fantasy novel. What other inspirations do you look toward as you're working either on your art or on this novel?
For the writing, it's definitely also Terry Pratchett's Discworld books. Those are very close to my heart. I grew up with them. They helped teach me English because I just wanted to read them in the original form so badly, because some of the translations are a little weird. I think one of the characters is called Carrot and they named him Beet in Dutch, which is not even the same vegetable. And for art, it's more, I think David Hockney illustrators like Molly Fairhurst are great as well. I don't really separate specific types or genres of art. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. And I guess, is there anything from an artistic standpoint that you're excited about working on?
I think the nicest, biggest inspiration that I took from Sapkowski's writing was the way he repeats his words, or he repeats sentences. I really want to incorporate that in my writing. I really want to make sure that if I change the repetition pattern in the last time I mention it, that it really has an impact. Yeah, I'm excited about that.
Oh, that's really interesting. For a couple of reasons, I think. That's one of my favorite things about his writing as well, particularly why Baptism of Fire is my favorite book in the Witcher saga. And in episode 6 of the podcast, Crisanto talked about the rule of thirds as being one of the primary, rules of comedy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's something that's been brought up in the podcast as well, and it's cool to see that you're taking inspiration from that in your own work.
Yeah, really works so well. I just think it's a really interesting concept.
Josh, it's also your first time here on the show. Would you be able to tell us about yourself and introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'm Josh. I'm from the U.S. I've been a massive fan of The Witcher ever since I played The Witcher 3 about 4 years ago. I played that game and immediately had to find every possible thing Witcher-related to just watch and read just to get more and more information and lore about it because I was so in love with it. Right now, I work as a paraeducator at a school with first graders, helping out with math and science and special education needs.
Yeah, that's incredible. This is like kind of my secret. And if I wasn't doing the career that I am, I would love to be an educator. Mm-hmm. Like for pre-K, that's like my secret dream.
My mom is a pre-K teacher, so we come from a family of teachers.
Oh, that's so nice.
I'm very used to working with younger kids, and especially pre-K.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. They're so funny at that age, I think. I think that's what I love about it.
They're a great bunch of kids, and I love working with them. They're so much fun to be with every day.
Mm-hmm. I guess just because this is, a different time, I think, for everybody. It's currently May as we're recording, but would you be able to tell us, I think, a little bit about what being an educator looks like right now?
Right now, it's a lot of Zoom calls, one-on-one Zoom calls with students, going over their homework, helping them with their reading assignments, helping them with any math problems they might have, checking in on them, making sure they're doing okay during this quarantine. It's very similar to what we did in school, but obviously remote with us being on Zoom calls. And we have been trying to make sure that they're getting the best education they can while being at home and not having all the same equipment and resources they have when they're at school.
Yeah, and that they have support every step of the way for, this inevitable period is incredibly important. And it's great to meet someone who has a part in that. To turn the conversation back to The Witcher and your own experience with fantasy, you mentioned that fantasy novels, that The Witcher has been a really strong inspiration and joy for you. What impact do you think indulging in fantasy or having exposure to fantasy has on kids?
I think fantasy can be a great outlet for people looking for either an escape from their own life or just to experience something new that they cannot do in real life. I can't cast fire from my hands or teleport places, but when I'm playing Dungeons & Dragons with my friends, I can do that. It's this whole new world you can enter in where you can do all these amazing feats. And it's incredibly fun to just be able to do those things in that world.
I think it's also really helpful right now. That's something that I notice around me, that more people are getting into Dungeons and Dragons, for example, because, that's also a way to be social, but also because they can go anywhere, even if they can't leave their house.
Yeah, some of my friends from college and I go on a Google Hangout every week or two. This week we're actually talking about doing a Harry Potter tabletop RPG. I've never done one before and I'm kind of excited, so I hope it works out and it's a lot of fun. Maybe one day we'll be able to do a Witcher one too.
They have one. I've been looking to find friends to get the Witcher tabletop game started, but have yet to do that.
Ooh.
But it is out there.
I would 100% bet that we have enough people in this international hanza and in our community who would be more than happy to join a tabletop RPG that was Witcher themed. So if anyone in the community wants to do that, let me know. Granted, this might be in September.
It's a good thing to get started in September.
Yeah, we'll make it happen. I guess the last question that I have for you, Josh, you mentioned that you're working toward becoming a professor later in your career. Could you tell us about what your goals are in the future?
I have been absolutely fascinated in ancient history. I have been trying to learn all I can about specifically the Achaemenid Empire, but also Mesopotamia, upwards to the Romans, just all that area and all the rich history within that crescent that has supplied so much technology that we use every day. I just want to learn as much as I can about it and hope that with my knowledge, I can then teach others what I know about it, and they can find joy in the same thing I find joy in.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, it's been really cool hearing about all the different kinds of history that some of our previous guests and our listeners are into. There's just so much to explore.
I feel like there's some kind of connection between people who are into fantasy and who are into history, because I think there's an overlap there.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I know a lot of people, my friends included her, who are into fantasy also are very much into history, and especially medieval history.
Yeah, we've got a lot of those in the Hanza too. So now that we've gotten to know both of our lovely guests, today we'll be discussing Before Fall, the penultimate episode in Netflix's first season of The Witcher. In this episode, Geralt and Yennefer prepare for war with Nilfgaard as Ciri continues to flee from it. In Geralt's timeline, the Witcher goes to Cintra to claim his child's surprise, fearing that she will not be safe when Nilfgaard attacks. Calanthe refuses and has the Witcher locked away where he's unable to save Ciri from the siege. This is the penultimate episode of the first season of The Witcher, and there's a lot of setup that happens not only in Geralt's timeline, but in Yennefer's and Ciri's as well as we head into the season finale. We circle back to a lot of different scenes and scenarios that we've seen in previous episodes, specifically a new perspective on Ciri's timeline from episode 1, and that's what we're going to be able to talk about with Geralt's timeline today. In Geralt's opening scene, he witnesses the approaching Nilfgaardian army in the Amel Pass.
That scene in the beginning of the episode where they're showing the sheer size of the Nilfgaardian army scared the shit out of Geralt. The little reactions he has, how scared he was.
A very big, Yeah. Well, I think That scary in combination with him already doubting from the previous few episodes. They've made sure that he has enough doubts about abandoning his child surprise that if he really sees that she's being threatened, he is going to take action now. And I think an army that big, that'll make an impression. Like, he's sure now.
This is something that he's seeing with his own eyes. He's witnessing the migration of Nilfgaardian forces to Cintra. And then that kind of comes to a head when he then goes to Cintra, speaks with Mousesack about this impending doom. Mousesack seems a little skeptical or is unwilling to help Geralt at first. And then eventually they make it to Calanthe. Calanthe has no regard for what Geralt has witnessed. You know, in my opinion, she does end up kind of being blinded by her own ego here. When the Witcher and Calanthe actually meet for the first time in 12 years, Calanthe is very angry toward Geralt and very cold toward him. She cites the fact that he never came back for his child's surprise. In the context of the show, it has now been 12 years since Pavetta and Duny's wedding. Calanthe shows a lot of resentment for the Witcher for never coming back, so why should Calanthe give her only granddaughter to someone who never cared to come back for her?
I think she's really projecting a lot of her anger about her daughter's death on him. I think she needs someone to blame for that, and he was there, and he was on the opposite side from her argument, so he's the perfect one to point out for that. And that combined with a little bit of her arrogance probably leads to her completely just shutting him down.
Yeah, I think Clancy must think that if Geralt wasn't there at the wedding, she wouldn't have married Duny, and then both Duny and Pavetta wouldn't have died in the storm. And yeah. I think since she can't blame Duny, now she's going to blame Geralt.
He's still alive to blame.
Exactly.
Here, we get to see, I think, Calanthe's preparation. She's been dealing with these skirmishes for however many years. She mentions to the head of her guard, you know, these uprising, these pretenders have been coming for years, and Calanthe believes she can stomp out Nilfgaard in the same way. As we've seen in previous episodes of the story, specifically the first one, that arrogance and that ego going into battle is what betrays her and leads to the fall of Cintra. And that's all pretty grim, especially because we spend most of the season getting to see Cintra in its glory and in its beauty, just to have it obviously fall in the first episode and again in the next.
I noticed that I find it very hard to notice Calanthe's weak points, I guess, because I just am enamored with her as a character. She's great. But then I think about her being the same person that, killed a lot of elves. Mm-hmm. And then I can see a bit more that she is the same person that also sees these armies as, nothing more than just a little challenge maybe. But it's no different than all the little other skirmishes she's done to protect Cintra.
Mm-hmm. Especially when they call Cintra the Jewel of the North. Mm-hmm. And when they show Nilfgaard in the wedding episode, they're nothing.
Yeah.
Even if she was to believe Geralt that people are coming, she'd be like, yeah, so what? It's Nilfgaard. I'll beat them like I beat everyone else.
She just completely has missed that Nilfgaard's not some backwater country anymore. They're now a full army.
Mm-hmm. And I think that from the other conversations that we've seen throughout the series, it's really clear that Calanthe has a lot of pride for Cintra, and that she's done a lot to protect it, particularly in the years after Pavetta and Duny's death. I'm sure if she were to spend, years and years fortifying just the city alone, that she would probably believe herself to be invincible to an extent. I mean, it's pretty crazy. And Elora, you had a note here about something that Mousesack and Geralt said to her as well.
Yeah, I noticed that they mentioned the law of surprise a lot of times in this episode, obviously. Mousesack says, kings who've tried to outbid destiny have ended up on pikes. That's where I thought, does Mousesack believe, or are we supposed to believe that her death and maybe the fall of Cintra are all because she refused to obey the law of surprise? Because my tendency is to think, well, but I guess like Geralt, I'm skeptical. But in a world where magic exists, maybe it's not so crazy.
Yeah. The comparison that I've seen, online has been Destiny and The Witcher is very similar to the Force in Star Wars. And it just kind of has this overarching control. You know, maybe it's physics of the world and maybe it's just a plot device. I guess we'll see.
They mention it again, bargaining with destiny in that way. So if she believes it in the end, then she will believe that it's her fault that her city has fallen or her country has fallen. That's rough.
Yeah. I guess at this point, we can really go into how she tries to outwit destiny. When Calanthe and Geralt meet, she tries to bribe the Witcher into leaving, but he refuses and says he can't be bought. Instead, Calanthe attempts to trick the Witcher by giving him a false Ciri. Geralt follows a passageway outside and witnesses the false Ciri address the real one as Your Highness. This is the scene that we see in the very first episode of the series, where in the first episode, she's outside playing knucklebones with some of the local boys. Now we're seeing this scene from another perspective, from Geralt's perspective, and we know that they see each other. This is why Ciri gives a mysterious kind of longing glance towards some passageway in the castle. It turns out that Geralt had been standing there, and we find that out 6-7 episodes later.
That got me so excited when I realized that was what they were doing.
What I really liked about that scene was even before Geralt went out to see the real Ciri, the way Geralt grabs the medallion, I think that was the first time they actually showed his medallion reacting to magic. And I think Mousak was trying to use some magic to try to tell him in a way that something's off here, you need to figure it out, but I can't exactly tell you, but something's off.
Yeah, that was a good point. I hadn't even noticed that was happening before I saw your comments.
I love that fact that the medallion in the book, that it does that. That I'm glad that they're incorporating it into the show, even if it is very subtle.
I think we're going to get a chance to talk into a little bit of production later. But in regards to, I think, the plot and the mythology around Witchers, there's a lot that is inferred or has to be inferred by the audience in this adaptation. Things like magic are kind of explained in the context of the world, but let's say the details of like Witcher senses, for example, or the way that they conduct themselves, a lot of it is stuff that we see on screen but isn't explicitly explained. It's nice to even get a little hint of that, even if we might come back to it more explicitly in later seasons or later episodes.
I have that with the conjunction of the spheres. I feel like a few sentences in the book and maybe a few sentences in the series, so I can piece together vaguely what happened, but they never actually go into it, I feel.
Yeah. That seems to be Sapkowski's style. Like, he introduces a thing just enough to make it relevant to the plot and then just runs away from explaining anything else about it. Hey guys, it's Alyssa. So we recorded this episode in May, and 2 months later in July, Netflix, Lauren Hissrich, and Declan DeBarra announced Blood Origins, a spin-off actually centering around the conjunction of the spheres and the first Witchers on the continent. So, Elora seemed to get her wish, and keep following Witcher Flicks and his Tidings from Tucson updates for continual news on the spin-off. Oh, well.
To get back to your point, I wonder what exactly Mousak did to make it vibrate, because I watched it again after reading that, and I tried to spot exactly where it happened. And that look that Mousak gives him through the door does make me think that it's him. But what is he doing exactly? Like, I don't see him doing magic. In the short stories, he communicates non-verbally.
He does, in A Question of Price.
Maybe they're trying to show that.
That's what I was thinking. It may not have shown the magic, but just that look was able to just do a little bit just to trigger the medallion going off.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if it's very clearly stated that Mousak is a druid and not a mage. But I think for a first-time viewer watching the show, the difference is, one, not really there, and two, probably doesn't matter. So I think it's interesting to see the differences in the magic that the mages could do versus Mousak. Mm-hmm. The way that it's shot, it's almost like Geralt is called to have that discovery. Like, a door opens mysteriously at the end of the hall. I actually skipped over that scene when watching it this morning because it's like a 3 to 4 minute shot of him just walking down corridors. And like the music gets really eerie and kind of mysterious, and then he ends up in the courtyard. And I wonder to what extent that could just be, you know, the law of surprise or destiny calling Geralt out into the street. But at least that's what I got from watching that scene or not watching that scene again.
I thought it could also be Mousak, but I don't know how far his magic stretches. I guess that's another thing that we just don't know.
Yeah.
If he is specifically trying to show Geralt Ciri, if he opens the door, maybe. But I don't know, maybe that's a reach.
And there's a very clear impact from Geralt understanding who's the real Ciri and who's the false Ciri. Geralt goes back inside the castle and immediately confronts Calanthe. Changing his wig in the process, it looks much better in this scene than it does in the previous and the following scenes. But yeah, he confronts Calanthe, who has absolutely no remorse for attempting to trick the Witcher. And she tells him up front she's queen to all of Cintra but grandmother to one, which is how she justifies not only trying to trick him but also in using someone else's daughter in order to do so. And at the end of the scene, Calanthe dismisses Geralt, leaving him in Iced's hands, who ultimately locks him up in the gatekeep.
That gate falls down exactly perfectly. It's like they marked an X exactly where Geralt had to stop so that it would fall down around him.
I was thinking the exact same. I was like, wow, they planned that thing out very well.
That's a Looney Tunes level trap.
When I watched it again this morning, I was like, was there another guard there just sitting and waiting to drop the gates?
Yeah, the most dramatic moment.
Like, this is it.
What I found most interesting about that scene is that even with all the times that you shouldn't mess with Destiny, Queen Calanthe is still trying to mess with it. She eventually finds out what happens when you mess with Destiny.
Yeah.
I think she might not be thinking completely rationally. I think she's like grieving her daughter and she will do anything. She's not, she doesn't care if the whole, all of Cintra falls down. If Ciri makes it, it's okay. But yeah, absolutely. She just still keeps going.
It must come back to ego or a false sense, as we'll see, of invincibility. Calanthe is one of my favorite characters, too. When we did the short story, A Question of Price in episode 4, all of my notes were just Calanthe quotes. That's all I talked about the whole time, was just the bars that she had throughout the whole entire episode. The soul and the spirit of the character is still very much the same in the Netflix adaptation, I think. That it really is, to an extent, like her against the world. And the world doesn't stand a chance, I think, is the impression that I get from Calanthe. There's absolutely nothing that she's incapable of in her eyes.
I mean, she's had it confirmed a lot before, I guess, that she really is the lioness and she's good in battle and she's good in court. Well, maybe she's not great in court. She's better in battle, probably. But she believes it. Destiny is also just another little army that she can just squash.
At this point, we see, again, a lot of scenes from the very first episode of the series that detail the siege on Cintra after the Battle of Marnadal. Once Nilfgaard has breached the gate, Geralt escapes his cell. And at that moment, Calanthe has returned from Marnadal wounded and sends Mousak to find the Witcher, but he's already gone. We get a much clearer perspective on a lot of ambiguous things that we saw in episode 1. So, for example, we finally hear Mousak's assignment, the request that Calanthe made of him. Turns out that was to find Geralt, who had been locked in the gatekeep. That's not something that Ciri knew, so it makes sense that we didn't hear it in episode 1 when she was the perspective that we had of this scene. Eventually, we see how everything shakes out. Geralt escapes his cell and goes looking for Ciri. By the time Mousak makes it to him, the Witcher's already escaped, and he can't directly bring Geralt to Ciri. That whole thing is incredibly unfortunate.
What I love about that scene is just Geralt's just meditating during the whole siege. And he finally wakes up and there's a loud blast above him. Like, oh.
Yeah, he could get out all that time because he does it in the end.
Yeah, you're just sitting there, just minding his own business while a whole city is collapsing.
Regenerating his health.
Exactly.
He does end up needing it. Like, the whole city is just completely under siege. The Cintran people are completely slaughtered by the Nilfgaardian army. The last few scenes that we see from Geralt's timeline are Geralt out in the streets of Cintra when he sees Calanthe's fall from the tower. He enters the castle desperately searching for Ciri, who has already escaped with her guard, and instead finds a Nilfgaardian who prophesizes at him and starts spouting Nilfgaardian propaganda.
Yeah, 2 points about this guy. My first one is that Geralt has half killed him by the time that he asks about Ciri, at which point I would not tell the truth. My second point is that I would have liked to hear the rest of that propaganda, because it started out the same way that the prophecy at the end of the episode does. So I was wondering, what exactly is it that the Nilfgaardians believe, and what is it that they're going after exactly?
Yeah, the almost like cult-like following of the White Flame is a very interesting way they made Nilfgaard and how they're so dedicated to the cause of taking Cintra and taking all this land.
He reminds me of one of the French kings, the one that's the Sun King. That one? Yeah, maybe just because of the sun.
Makes sense.
When they used to think that kings were, chosen by God to be the king, I feel like that's the way they see him. He's not just human, I think, in their eyes.
I can definitely see that, them almost revering him as a literal god in their kingdom, and they'll do anything for him as he is a god.
They see it as doing a good thing. They see it as helping Cintra become, a modern country, I think.
I wrote somewhere in here about the way later in the episode they talk about how they're helping out Cintra, and it's almost like a colonialism kind of thing where they're taking over to help the savages and to bring their better way of life to these people. So it's interesting just to see the similarities between those two world powers, both in our world and in their world.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we've kind of seen Nilfgaard set up as this very big villain throughout the entire series, but they're still as equally mysterious to us in this episode as they were in previous episodes. We didn't see the progression from, as we said, that backwater country that we saw in episode 4. We still don't really know why, as you said, why they're so cult-like, where these beliefs come from. But hopefully we'll be able to break it down in further seasons of the show.
I think they'll come back to the change from backwater country to full nation, I think. Maybe. I'd like them to.
Yeah.
The same way they had, like, in this episode, not a lot of stuff from the books with this episode, but they added a lot of background and stuff like that to what was going on. I really do hope they show the rise of Nilfgaard and what exactly Emperor Emir did to that country to make them this global superpower.
And it's a more compelling villain if you know more about them too. If they're just a pure evil, you see them using blood magic and they're clearly depicted as the bad guy. But then you hear in this episode some things that almost sound like good things to do, or no, that's not quite it. At least believe that they're treating their people well. I feel like I remember in the books as well that they aren't necessarily pure evil, and that maybe they're not worse than the other kingdoms because those are also not great. That is to me a more interesting perspective than they are the pure evil force.
I think it very much comes down to the idea that everyone is the hero of their own story. So I think, as you said, it's going to be really interesting to see, and it would make a very compelling story to understand their motivations on a very base level and have us empathize with Nilfgaard to an extent. It would make the story a lot more complex for us as viewers. All exciting stuff. Because coming from the books, this is a spoiler-free show, so coming from the books, I have feelings about Nilfgaard. I'm not going to say more than that. But I think it would be really good to see that play out on screen, and I hope that we get that in the coming seasons of the show.
I think they've done a great job so far with filling in the little blanks, so it would be great. They might.
Geralt's story ends rather abruptly. Did you guys have anything else to add about it, or any questions that you wanted to discuss?
Well, no, just a general note that Geralt's storyline was very exciting to watch, because it really felt like this puzzle that you'd been working on since the beginning of the season had finally come together, and you could fill everything in. And I can imagine, especially if you come to the show completely new and you really, really have to work at the story, that this is a really satisfying storyline to watch.
This episode brings a lot of stuff together that you had no idea what was going on, and it helps fill in a lot of pieces to help you more understand the story a lot better.
Again, setting up ourselves and setting up the rest of the audience for that final series finale where everything needs to make sense.
Yeah. They've been throwing hints every episode. I really like the way they connect the storylines, but if you haven't been able to follow that, then here they tell you a few of the storyline bits.
And I think this is one of the first times that we'll see in the series that Geralt's timeline aligns really nicely with Yennefer's, and they're in separate places. At this point, we're seeing Geralt's and kind of what is happening in Cintra versus what is happening in other parts of the continent with Yennefer's storyline. In her storyline, Yennefer is recruited by Vilgefortz, a member of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, and Tissaia to join them in a fight against Nilfgaard. In her opening scene, Yennefer visits Istrid at a Nilfgaardian excavation site in Azir. Their lives have diverged since Aretuza. Yennefer proposes renewing their relationship, and Istrid rejects her. She's then approached by Vilgefortz of Roggeveen to go to Aretuza and support the Brotherhood of Sorcerers.
I think that scene was very well made. You can see the disconnect between Istrid and Yennefer now, and how much they've grown apart since their relationship back at Aretuza. But I also found really funny about that scene was just Vilgefortz creeping in the background behind Yennefer and Istrid as they're talking about their relationship. And the minute Istrid leaves, he kind of like sulks over.
When the scene starts, you can see him in the background just barely pretending to not be listening.
While I was home this past week, I recently watched a video about what grips do, how lighting works. It's really interesting to watch that scene after seeing a video about how lighting works. And this is like my very, very simple understanding of it. So please forgive me if you're a professional in this field. But when you watch the scene, there's a key light that comes in directly in front of Yennefer that, shows her face. But because of the layout of this tavern, Vilgefortz also has a direct light on his face, even though he's in the background. And that's not something that you would probably normally see in a busy inn scene like this. But because that character is going to be important later, we already know by the lighting and by the position of the camera that he might be important. Same thing happens when the camera turns around and looks at Istrid. We actually see Vilgefortz's back. He's still in frame while they're having that intimate conversation.
Yeah, it's really nice to see how they use those kinds of techniques to tell the story as well, because you're not going to be aware of it probably when you're watching, but it is working.
It's almost like a principle of good design and good production that if you're doing your job and your work is good, that people don't notice it. So it's pretty cool that, like, as you said, when it came to how production elements help tell the story, I think that they've done a really nice job in this scene here, and it's been really successful.
They make sure that you notice Vilgefortz before he starts talking. The first time I watched this episode, I guess I was so drawn into it that I wasn't fully thinking, maybe logically. Again, probably like I said with Calanthe, I just see Yennefer and I'm like, yeah, there she goes, without really thinking about her motivations. I just like to watch her work. I guess I was surprised to see her return to Istrid, because I felt that the way they broke up and the things she said then, they felt really true to me, or at least I thought that they wouldn't be happy together for those reasons. But then I thought logically. I thought it was a really nice way to show that that Yennefer has changed since the last time they saw each other. And now actually those things do sound good to her, because she's seen what power and exciting courts are like, and they're not very exciting. And maybe she just wants to be able to trust someone and have a nice, calm life.
I wonder what Yennefer's motivations are here. It could just always be that the grass is greener no matter where she is. I don't know. There's a few things that I noticed in this scene when it came to how Yennefer conducted herself and how she interacted with Istrid. They're always kind of in each other's space. Just their body language is incredibly intimate. There's a few times that it looks like they're going to kiss or become intimate before they actually kiss later in the scene. The other thing that stood out to me was when Istrid is asking Yennefer essentially why now. She tells him, I've had the experiences that I wanted. They weren't what I needed. She basically said something that amounted to, the people who wanted me wanted the power that came with my position at court. They didn't want my power. Istrid then asks, am I the only one who sees it? And it turns back to Yennefer's face, and she kind of falters for a second. Part of me wondered if that's because of Geralt, if she already had those experiences with Geralt and she knows that he is one other person, aside from Istrid, who she had that kind of relationship with and who she had that kind of trust with.
I thought about that as well. She doesn't respond to it directly, I think. She avoids the question.
I thought the same exact thing when I first saw that, when they say that line and she's has that look in her face that she's thinking about Geralt during that.
It makes me wonder, we've seen her in the previous episode, Rare Species, where she would do anything for a child of her own, which makes me wonder what kind of sacrifices she's making in order to pursue this relationship with Istrid. If she's, settling for something that she can't get elsewhere, or if she's just resigned that she can't find it elsewhere, so she might as well be with Istrid.
Yeah, maybe she believes that she has still had this option on standby, but now it turns out that he doesn't want that anymore.
When Yennefer first finds Istrid, she comes across a Nilfgaardian excavation site. Some of the kind of, at least in my opinion, conflicting things that we know about it. One is that there are guards around this whole site, and one of them shouts, you'll see it in the subtitles if you watch the show, that the people who are working are not allowed to have water until they're done. But later in the scene, Istrid says that the people who are on the camp were starving before Nilfgaard came. Yennefer then condemns this by saying that, well, everyone has the same thing. It's interesting to actually see what life under Nilfgaardian rule is like for ourselves before we see in other parts of the story what Nilfgaardian warfare looks like, because it's incredibly brutal. We'll see in a later scene Fringilla's first-hand account of what Nilfgaard is like as well.
The thing that Istrid mentions, that they were starving before, I think that might be how they keep power. Because if they had it terrible before and they give them something slightly better, even if it's still not fair or good, they might be less likely to protest or to return to their old ways, if they were even able to. At least Nilfgaard is the one that feeds them, even if they feed them bad food or very little.
I thought it was interesting as if they're treating Nilfgaard as almost like a sort of a communist-esque nation in their world, with making sure everyone's fed, even if it is the exact same thing. It's interesting to see if they're trying to allude to it being more like that, or if we'll see something more in the future. It is looking like that from that one scene.
As I said before, I think seeing this scene paints a much more holistic picture of Nilfgaard. Not only what they are now, but why they're kind of doing the things that they're doing, what motivates them. You know, we understand that a lot of the people who are now under Nilfgaardian rule were under corrupt kings. They were under people who only served themselves and didn't serve their communities and their countries. As you said, Elora, even giving people something marginally better may turn allegiances. I think this provides some, at least sympathy, if not to the Nilfgaardian Empire, at least to the people who are currently living in it. But I guess we'll see. Istrid starts talking about monoliths, and his ultimate desire is to continue his research. He briefly alludes to his research possibly providing hints or possibly bringing new evidence for the prophecy. He says explicitly, like, the prophecy. I guess hopefully if this is another piece of like foreshadowing or another piece of the puzzle about what we see toward the end of this episode with Ciri and what we've seen in previous episodes with the Nilfgaardian army, that whatever this prophecy is, it actually comes to fruition.
I wanted to mention that monolith. The design of it is the same as the design of Aatusa. It has the same kind of harsh lines and colors, which would make sense since they're both supposed to be from before the conjunction of the spheres, but that was a nice touch.
Yeah, I've always wondered about these monoliths, especially when he was talking about how they might be able to provide the past and the future and just magic in general.
Because we have a few. There's like the Tower of the Gull, if we're thinking of the same kind of monolith. There's the Tower of the Gull. There's the one that's part of Cintra. I wonder how those things will play out. In the following scenes, Yennefer accepts Vilgefortz's invitation, and she enters Aretuza for the first time in years. She's grown resentful of her time there, which colors her interactions with the current novices. Tissaia intervenes, confronting Yennefer. A lot of Yennefer's time in this storyline is dedicated to her interactions with the current Aretuza novices, but it's pretty shady. Like, she she like goes into her old room. There's a bunch of other students there. She gives them psychedelics and then scares the crap out of them by showing them the eel mill. Like, it's a little messed up.
I get the eel mill, but every time I rewatch it, I get to the psychedelics and I'm just like, what do you think you're convincing them of by doing this?
It's almost like a little rebel without a cause sort of thing that, screw the system.
She just wants to kick against the system of Aretuza in general. Doesn't matter what.
We're seeing Yennefer in an environment that was used to break her and remold her. And now she's back, and it's an entirely different experience this time around. Presumably she's been gone for decades. We know she spent at least 30 or 40 years in Aedern's court before the events of episode 3, Betrayer Moon. And then who knows how long it has been since Betrayer Moon to now. In that time, we learned that Aretuza started accepting students from money instead of only accepting girls who had a conduit moment of magic. So she's a little disheartened by that throughout the episode.
It's probably much harder to turn one of those students from money into an eel than someone who their family wanted to get rid of or who didn't come from a very clear background at all. Someone would start to ask questions if it's from some kind of noble family. So I don't know if that would grant them the privilege of remaining human, or if that meant that they would become full sorceresses just because of their status and their money.
We don't necessarily get an explicit reason for why Tissaia is letting these girls in, other than one of the girls mentions, like, the Brotherhood thinks it's a good idea, and Tissaia mentions, you have to compromise in order to survive. But the reason for survival, at least I didn't see an explicit one.
If they were paid to go there and they didn't have a conduit moment, would they even work if they were turned into eels to help power Artusa? Would they even be able to turn into mages at all? Like, are they literally just useless?
What are they even doing in their classes at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not really useful, and they can't really be eels if they can't conduct magic. But it sounds like from Yennefer's conversation with the novices, I guess Artusa is just using them for their family's resources. One of the girls mentioned that her payment for education was like 50 horses or something like that. So maybe it's just a matter of not just funding the school, but funding the Brotherhood's initiatives throughout the continent.
Well, I feel like if you come from like a noble family and you're sending your daughter to this prestigious school to be learned to become a mage, and then they can't do that, they can't turn your daughter into a mage, I feel like you'd want like payment back, or you talk bad about the school. I may be taking too much into this, but it's just interesting the way they have this done.
Right, a poor Yelp review and a request to speak to the manager, and you'll see what happens. I don't know. I think it just shows, as Yennefer says, how much the school has fallen in terms of its prestige. But that conversation is then cut really short. It's an emergency conclave of northern mages, as we learn from Triss, who we met in episode 3, Betrayer Moon, in Geralt's storyline. At this conclave, they've just been notified of the battle at Marnadal, so this is then happening simultaneously with Geralt's storyline now, and they're trying to decide if they should intervene between Marnadal and Cintra. There's a lot of tension between northern mages who want to help Cintra regardless of their rejection of mages over the decades, and mages who want to let Cintra be as they are. As they're debating, Fringilla enters, insisting that Cintra is their only target. There's a vote, and the Brotherhood votes to leave Cintra to their own devices and to their own defenses, therefore sealing their fate. Ignoring the vote, Tissaia begs Yennefer to join the fight.
That conversation between them is very interesting because their dynamic has completely flipped, right? Tissaia is the one in a position of weakness because she's asking Yennefer for something. That expression that Yennefer has during that conversation is really, she's looking down on her almost literally, I think. She's returned to this school where she was in a position of weakness, but now she does kind of feel above it, I think. The Brotherhood is still very disrespectful of her, I guess, but her relationship with Tissaia has changed.
What I find interesting about this is how much power Fringilla has within Nilfgaard, that she can come to this meeting and explain everything that they're doing. She's basically an ambassador for the whole entire kingdom, talking about what they're going to do, what they have been doing, and they're not going to attack any other nations after this.
It's interesting to see the possible corruption within the Brotherhood at this point, which, they start calling each other out on the awful atrocities that they've done to their communities and to each other. Stregobor throws Vilgefortz's military experience back at him, causing Tissaia to bring up the Curse of the Black Sun, and Stregobor killing babies because of it. Then we see Fringilla come in. She then reminds the entire room that she's only in the position that she's in because Yennefer declined it. I say declined, but really she did that whole backwards thing at the end of Betrayer Moon and got Fringilla outed from that position. Fringilla's uncle is the one who proposes keeping out of Cintra's problems, paving the way for his niece to go in and demolish the whole place. It's interesting, I think, as we've seen in episode 3, how powerless Tissaia is in this environment, against all these other mages and against the Brotherhood. And then we see her resolve to ignore it and then to go and fight on her own with the other mages.
I wondered if what they say is true. Fringilla is very adamant that they're a better leader for the countries that they occupy than the leaders that were there before. Since we saw the scene at Istred's dig site, arguably they're still not well off, but they're maybe slightly better off. Do they actually believe that?
The Northern Mages seem to believe that Fringilla was lying at all when she was saying that they're not going to take anything north of Cintra. I thought that was strange.
I wonder if part of that is because of her uncle, that he would just kind of pave the way for her, regardless of her motivations or what she says.
Yeah.
I agree, very few of them are really skeptical about her intentions. I wonder about their morality as well and where their allegiances lie, just because it's very clear in Tissaia's actions that they believe that this war, no matter who it's fought against, is still wrong. Whereas Stregobor, Artorias, they believe that the politics should dictate if they get involved or not. So it's interesting to see, like, how their morality shapes the coming events, which is a huge theme that we started in episode 1 with Geralt.
They're not making the ethical choice necessarily. They're making the choice that makes sure that they can stay in the position they want, because otherwise maybe Artorias makes that difficult for them.
And I would think if they're making a selfish choice, Fringilla just admitted that they put mages into slavery, essentially. And if they continue to go north after Cintra, they could be put into servitude for the Nilfgaardian army. You would think they'd want to not have to do that, but I guess they didn't think that far.
That does make sense with what we've seen in other parts of the episode. When Vilgefortz first approaches Yennefer, he mentions to her why they're being quiet and why they're operating in incognito is because Nilfgaard brings in mages, so they have to kind of sneak out. And then we see that when Triss questions Fringilla about using mages as soldiers. And Fringilla confirms this. This is something that we'll see a payoff to in the next episode. There's a couple of interesting lines about their motivations as they're arguing. Fringilla says, in Nilfgaard, we know what it's like to have corrupt leaders, but under our new leader, Emperor Emhyr, we've changed. We've strengthened trade, funded research, torn down walls, whilst Queen Calanthe has done nothing but put them up. Tessias says in response, I'm not here to defend Cintra, but I will defend our way of life. The Brotherhood, the academies, the order that we've built up over centuries. You've rejected it all, Fringilla. And she responds, it's not true, we've modified it. Most of us came from Aretuza and Banard. We've simply chartered a different path, guided by the white flame. That makes us cousins, not enemies. And then it kind of goes into the differences between the approaches to magic and culture between the Northern Kingdoms and Nilfgaard. Yep, but we're seeing the cults-like mentality of Nilfgaard in this conversation with Fringilla as well.
What I thought interesting was Fringilla talking about the dark and light magic. There really is no such thing. It's just magic. They decide what they think is light and what they think is dark, and Nilfgaard's not like that. They're just going to use magic, whether it be the dark magic or the light magic. They're going to use whatever they can to win.
Yeah, I think that's the similar kind of thing, that they don't care about the ethics of it. If maybe the dark magic is defined as dark magic because it's cruel to the person casting it or to someone around them, but that doesn't matter to them. They just use magic.
The discourse throughout the scene makes explicit what the difference between the Northern Realms and Nilfgaard has been throughout every episode preceding this, and then also sets up really nicely the purpose of conflict, as we'll see in the following episode much more. By the end of Yennefer's storyline, this is where Tissaia then asks Yennefer for her help, again setting up the events of the next and final episode. I feel like there's so much that just gets set up in this episode. So it's like and then it's just like, at the very end, it's like, okay, and we'll talk about it next time.
You'll watch the next episode immediately anyway. This is just a long 2-part last episode.
Absolutely. In Ciri's storyline, the fleeing princess stops in a market town on her way to Skellige. A woman tries to offer her kindness. Instead, Ciri steals her horse and rides off. She makes a small fire for herself in a field, where she's approached by some of the boys from Cintra, who threaten to give her to Nilfgaard and attack. Ciri loses control and begins to prophesize. Verily I say unto you, the era of the sword and axe is nigh, the era of the wolf's blizzard. The time of the white chill and the white light is nigh, the time of madness and the time of contempt. She screams, and then the episode closes.
That prophecy is shot very nicely as well. The way they change the shots very quickly to make it kind of unsettling, and they close up on her face to make sure it's like kind of otherworldly and strange. That was nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was very well shot. I think the word used, unsettling, was great. It made it seem creepy and like demonic in the way like they kind of shot it, but also prophesizing the future.
It's disorienting. This isn't the first time that we've heard at least part of this prophecy. In one of the previous episodes, after slaughtering an entire tavern, the knight who has been chasing Ciri wipes his bloodied sword and says, the time of the sword and the axe is nigh. At this point, we know that it's something that could be connected to the Nilfgaardian cult. And it's interesting to see then Ciri say it here. And again, I wonder if there's a connection to Istrid talking about like capital T, the prophecy as well. There's, I think, more questions after this than there are answers.
I think Ciri's whole whole storyline in all of the episodes basically are just her slowly losing trust in the world, slowly discovering that she has this power, which is terrifying to her as well. And now she fully uses that power so that by the last episode, she is not the girl she was anymore. She's ready for season 2.
I always wondered if Calanthe and Pavetta ever talked to Ciri about their source power within their lineage. But from what her face seems after her source burst, it seemed like there was never any discussion about that.
Yeah. I don't quite remember how old Ciri is supposed to be when Pavetta dies.
In the books, it has to be before she's 6 because Geralt visits her when she's 6 and Pavetta's already dead. I'd imagine it'd be early on here because Calanthe talks about raising Ciri as her own. She looks older than 12, but based on the dialogue, I'd imagine she'd be 11 or 12. I would say that must have happened between the time she was 3 and 6, if I was to guess.
I think maybe she was too young for that conversation when it was Pavetta who would have that conversation with her. And I think Calanthe really hates everything that reminds her of law of surprise and all the supernatural kind of things.
So the 2 times that we've seen this reaction from Ciri, or actually 3, the first was when Calanthe was dying and she sent Ciri away. That's when she had her first moment where kind of all the glasses shook. The second time is when she escaped that night in the first episode after the fall of Cintra. She had again a magical, powerful moment, bringing down yet another monolith. This is the 3rd time, I believe, that we've seen on screen that this happens. And it's much stronger than the first 2 times and is very consuming. She completely goes into an uncontrollable trance and starts prophesizing. The first time, it was just a little bit, 2 little hints of what happened. And then I guess we'll see here that rule of thirds. The 3rd time it happens, we have a completely different experience, contrary to our expectations. To go to the point of, has this been talked about before? As I said, the first time that we see this, Ciri is being sent away from her grandmother. When Laszlo takes her away, Calanthe asks Mousesack, did you see that? Because this is really the first time that Ciri's under duress. This is why it's coming out. She's been very protected her whole life. This is the first real struggle that she's had.
Yeah, maybe the more distressed she gets, maybe the stronger the response is as well. Because now that it's the 3rd time, she's already aware that it's possible that this happens, and she's already scared of that happening. And then Tara told her, you only harm others, and she fully doesn't trust anyone. So she's at a very bad low point in her story at that point.
She was definitely so protected in her castle walls and within her kingdom that now that she's out in the world, she's seeing all the negativity and all the struggles everyone goes through outside. And I think it's weighing on her really badly. She's going to start becoming more nihilistic and pessimistic about everything in the world and not trusting anyone and not seeing good in people. And I'm curious to see how that goes down in the next couple of episodes and next season.
And if she would, fully trust Geralt at that point, maybe, if she's so, pessimistic about people.
I think that sets up a really nice struggle for at least the first half of season 2. Calanthe just told Ciri to find Geralt, but as you said, Elora, why should she trust him? Who is he? What importance does he have to Ciri and Calanthe? We have no idea. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when those characters really start to get to know each other in season 2. Before we jump into our standout parts of the episode, we're going to hand it over to Lars from Witcherflix for recent news on the Netflix show. When we come back, Elora, Josh, and I will continue our discussion of Before Fall.
Hey, it's Lars from Witcherflix, and this is Tidings from Toussaint. Welcome back, everybody. Even though England is under lockdown because of the virus at the moment, filming for Season 2 of The Witcher is still well on its way. The Witcher crew is shooting in England at the moment, and let's see what's new on the Witcher set. Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire has turned into a Witcher hub. Let's see what happened there in the last 2 weeks. The ruins of the old medieval monastery have turned into an elven palace. Elvish banners with floral sigils as well as atmospheric braziers were blazed around the ruins to make it look like it was a place on the continent. Of course, if you hear Elven Palace as well as the book Blood of Elves, which is adapted for Season 2, you automatically think of Sherawet, a very important place for the history of the elves on the continent. This elven palace lies in ruins in the times of Geralt and Ciri, but is a big symbol for the oppression of the elves by the humans. But of course, elves were also roaming the ruins of Fountains Abbey. There were a bunch of elven extras, but we also had our first look at Misia Simpson in costume, as the elven sorceress Francesca Findabair. She wears a very delicate dress with a long robe adorned with peacock feathers. Most importantly, there's a tiny little detail you immediately notice about Francesca. She is pregnant. This is different from how she describes herself in the books, as Francesca explicitly states that she is no longer able to bear a child. But if we look back at Francesca's character description for the casting call, we had already known that Francesca was having a child. It reads as follows: "The most beautiful woman in the world, so beautiful she wears a mask, clever, politically powerful, a mother who would do anything to protect her child." This gives Francesca a completely new motivation to fight for the elves, and possibly makes her even more fierce. Another interesting detail on the set pictures posted by Redanian Intelligence is Francesca, how she plucks a white rose. The white rose is another very important symbol in the elven culture on the continent. The flower symbolizes Eliren, who started a final suicidal assault against the humans. The elf later got known as the White Rose of Sherawet, the aforementioned elven palace. Next to the pictures of Francesca, we catch our first glimpse at Mimi Hindiveni as Fringilla Vigo in her Season 2 dress. It is almost Snow White with a lot of intricate details. We can see her talk to Francesca and stroll through the ruins of the palace. What are the two talking about? Sure, if you think about what happens in the books, they are surely hatching a plot against the Northern Kingdoms, their common enemy. Fringilla, as a representative of the Empire of Nilfgaard that wants to conquer the North, and Francesca as leader of the elves who are oppressed by the humans of the North for generations. But Fringilla isn't alone at the Elven Palace. The Nilfgaardian army has come too. There were several pictures of Nilfgaardian tents, soldiers, carts and banners around the ruins of Fountains Abbey. Are they here to negotiate with the elves and the Scoia'tael? Moreover, we have our first look at the new Season 2 Nilfgaardian armor. Eamon Farron, as Cahir, has entered the scene as well as some fellow soldiers. The new armor looks very distinct. It's now golden with black trousers and some interesting details like the Great Sun. It gives the impression of elven armor, which is quite fitting, as the Nilfgaardians have elven ancestry that dates back almost 1000 years. In the case of Cahir, he also wears a new helmet, which also has some raven wings, exactly as described in the books. Moreover, the set was also visited by other actors. Some very sneaky locals took, unfortunately very blurry, pictures of Geralt in his new armor on set. He was accompanied by his trusted horse, Roach. Mahesh Jadoo as Vilgefortz was also present, which is very fitting if you think about his character arc throughout the main saga. But he wasn't the only mage on set. Mariana Buring as Tisaya, Therica Wilson-Reed as Sabrina, and Lars Mikkelsen as Stregobor were also filming scenes. But among the most interesting actors who returned to the set is arguably Sean Dooley, who played King Foltest of Temeria in Season 1. Now, he also shoots some scenes at or around Fountains Abbey according to his Instagram stories. Of course, Foltest returning to the set makes you think of one of the most important scenes from the book Blood of Elves, where the most important kings of the north gather for a secret meeting at Hage Castle to discuss the political situation with Nilfgaard. This would mean that monarchs like Vizimir of Redania, Henselt of Cadwen, Demawend of Edirn, and Meath of Lyria and Rivia could soon make an appearance as well. In other non-Fountains Abbey related news, Witcher Blood Origin showrunner Declan de Barra has written on Twitter that all the Blood Origin episodes have been outlined and the writers have started to write the actual scripts for the individual episodes. So Witcher Series number 2 is also well on its way. Last but not least, Netflix has posted a funny little Halloween-themed video on social media showing the iconic monsters of Season 1, including 2 hidden treats. In this little video, eagle-eyed viewers were able to spot 2 new shots from Season 2. The first one shows a very strange, disgusting-looking monster that consists of various bones, some flesh, and a very eerie eyeball staring into the distance. A monster like this doesn't appear in the books. The second shot shows 3 spooky skeletons wearing old cloths and pearl necklaces. It's hard to say if Geralt encounters these 3 skeletons while exploring another crypt, or if these 3 skeletons belong to some important historical figures. Well, we will have to wait and see for ourselves in Season 2. Anyway, guys, that's it for me for today. I hope you all stay safe and well. We talk again in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Until then, thanks again for listening and good luck on the path.
Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. I'm here with Elora and Josh discussing Before a Fall from Season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher. When we left off, we'd broken down the plot of the episode, and now it's time to dive into the key points and themes that interested us most.
I like the way this episode repeats situations that we've seen earlier in the series. It serves a purpose. It shows us that these characters have changed since the beginning of the series. So Geralt is back in Cintra, where he was during the banquet, but that time he was very dismissive of the idea of taking care of this child's surprise, and now he's at least concerned. Yennefer returns to Aretuza. Aretuza has changed, and she has changed, and she's not this powerless, vulnerable person anymore. And Ciri gets an offer of safety, which she did as well in episode 2, when we were in the Cintran camp. And this time she doesn't trust it, she doesn't accept it. And I think that's a really good way of showing us the character development that's been happening. And then I also thought about the repetition that Sapkowski uses, the sentences that he uses, like the sort of destiny has two edges or something more, which are beautiful, and and every time they're mentioned, they become stronger. And in the times he changes the way he uses them, that has huge impact. And the show uses that as well, because it repeats these locations to show character developments, but it also repeats almost some shots, like Yennefer looking into the mirror. It repeats its themes as well, but they change slightly every time. So I just thought that was a really interesting phenomenon, and especially this episode demonstrates it very well, I think.
As we spoke about earlier, repeating elements also kind of builds out the world and the lore. Like, we see these things multiple times, we build an expectation of it, whether that's then doubled down upon or subverted.
I think it's a very satisfying way to tell a story. I look for it in all the books I read, I guess, because I want to write like that. It's like a very good detective or a very good mystery, where each element is very important, but you don't know until the third time that it's mentioned that it's important and why it's important. That is just clever writing. That's a well put together product, because you don't think about it linearly, I think, when you make it. You probably know where you're going and then you work backwards, or you know, okay, I need to show an example of the way Ciri is progressing, so then I will repeat this element.
I think Sapkowski did a great job with his writing and how he does that same exact thing, and the showrunners implemented it very well in the show, and how they took the material that it was especially needed from the books and put it into the show to make the viewers understand and to really enjoy Sapkowski's writing and how he does things.
It's that same way of working, but they adapt it for a different medium very well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's nice to get not only the cues in dialogue with repetition, but also things like visual cues. As you said, Elora, it gives us an audience a greater understanding of, again, the motivations behind each of these characters, and why the plot progresses the way that it does, and why events happen on the continent the way that they do. It's just cool. And it's effective.
It's why something more so such a good and powerful phrase, because you keep hearing it and it keeps changing its meaning. And then I remember the podcast episode where you read out that bit of something more, and it made you emotional, and it made me emotional as well. And then I read that bit of the story again like a few weeks ago, and it still got me. So it's just really effective.
Yeah, someone, I came across a screenshot in my phone, because I'll sometimes save really nice things that people from the Hanza and from the community send me. But someone had written in response to that last episode, episode 15, they're just like, I've only cried 2 times listening to your podcast, during S.E. Davin's episode, A Little Sacrifice, and then during the end of Something More. And I was like, that makes me sad, but it makes me happy. I don't know what to tell you. As we spoke about in episode 15 with Lars, there's an incredible emotional payoff because of the journey that happened in Something More. You know, as you said, Something More is a really good example of that repeating narrative. As we spoke about in Ciri's timeline, the era of the sword and the axe is nigh is something that we've now seen repeated twice between, you know, someone from Nilfgaard versus our main protagonist.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It makes it kind of mysterious, especially for new viewers, as to what that interpretation might be, we have someone who we perceive as a villain, and not only as any villain, but as Ciri's personal villain in horror. And then we see her repeat the same words, completely lost control. She's prophesizing. It alludes to something greater than our characters, at least in my opinion. So now that we've spoken about some of the structure that goes into the show and its plot, we could turn the conversation over to production, which brings us to Josh.
The whole show in its entirety has been an excellent example of quality production, with everything from its visual production to how, like you said before, the lighting and how the subtle little cues they do to help navigate the story. One of my absolute favorite parts so far has been the costumes of each of the characters. They each have such unique yet descriptive costumes that really portray who they are as a person and a character. One of my favorites that came in this episode was Vilgefortz, with his armor / tunic presenting himself as not only a mage, but also his background as a mercenary and a fighter. I think they do an excellent job of subtly throwing these production things in there that really enhance the show.
I noticed it with Calanthi's costumes, because she wears that armor, which has the lion's paws on its shoulders.
Yeah.
And then she changes to the dress, which has embroidery exactly where the lion's paws would be, which is so good. And then her dress looks like a chainmail in the kind of fabric that they use. That's so detailed and like sets her down as the lioness again.
When I first saw her armor with the shoulders and the lions on them, I thought that was just incredible work for the costume designer. They have put so much effort into really all the fine details of everyone's wardrobe, and I think it's just been an amazing job seeing every new piece of clothing they wear and how much work and time has been put into each one of them.
Yeah, I've spoken about this on previous episodes. Notably episode 16 with Cyprian and Reza. At the time of recording, it'll come out in about 3 weeks, which is really exciting. I will start the season. But in episode 16 with Cyprian and Reza, we talked about the costumes as well. And this is a really great episode to return to that discussion because we see all of the mages. Their costuming is even more elaborate than the costuming that we see. A little bit more modern, but that kind of suits the mages, their purpose, their background. Everything that they have is a little bit more extra than what would be expected for the period.
I bet there's like only a fraction of what the detail in those costumes that I'm going to spot on screen. They really knew what they were doing there.
Oh yeah.
It made me sad in this episode to see like how dirty her velvet gloves were. And then she just threw it into the mud. Yeah. And I'm like, they must have dozens of that for production, but like I died a little bit inside.
It really shows the fact they put all this time and effort into it. I'm really impressed by them, and I cannot wait for how much better they can do in season 2 with probably a bigger budget and more resources available to them.
Especially because I'm really curious to see what happens when the plot progresses and how that has an impact on production and how production rises to the challenge. The very last thing we're going to chat about in this episode of Breakfast in Beauclair is comparisons to the original source material. We see a lot of things that weren't explicitly shown in the books, and some of the source material is changed in order to make sense, I think, for the characters and for the medium. Ciri and Yennefer's storylines are pretty new, so we never actually see the Battle of Sodden in the books. We just hear about it secondhand from Jurga in Something More. Same thing with Ciri's time as a refugee. This isn't actually something that we ever see in the books because the majority of short stories are exclusively from Geralt's perspective. We only hear about her time as a refugee briefly throughout the saga.
I'm very glad that they did it like this. We mentioned before that how well they filled in the little gaps that were left by the story. And I think that's especially true for Ciri and Yennefer, because if they'd followed the books exactly to the letter, Ciri would have appeared maybe once or twice. And I don't know if the viewer would have been prepared for her becoming a main character, or if they'd be attached enough to her. And that's true for Yennefer as well. I notice that when people only play the games, they sometimes just think she's very harsh and much too cold. I really like that she gets to be harsh and be a love interest at the same time. But I understand how that could be off-putting if you don't understand the context. So I'm glad they gave her that context, because I think that makes her more sympathetic.
I do like they added all these extra background stuff, like especially Yennefer's time at Aretusa or Ciri's time running away from the fall of Cintra. I think they were great addition pieces that they added to give the main characters more information about themselves for the later saga that's about to come.
Something that the showrunner Lauren Hissrich has noticed is that she wanted to bring in these characters earlier so that, as you said, Elora, we as viewers actually have a connection to these people. I think there are certain parts of the approach that definitely confused people. It's, I think, common knowledge that a lot of people were shuffled around by the timelines, especially for ones that were new to the show. But it does do its purpose. We do understand Yennefer and Ciri, and we can connect with them as viewers as well.
I guess I'll be glad when it becomes more chronological, I assume, by the second season, because I just want people to like The Witcher as much as I do. So I want it to be accessible. But I personally really like the jumping around, because I really liked piecing it together and hearing like one string of a sentence repeated between two timelines so that I could puzzle it out on my head and make sense of it. But if you're just trying to watch a show and you're not trying to solve a puzzle, I understand that it could be a little off-putting.
So I think they towed this nice line of trying to appease new people while also trying to please people who have already read everything Witcher related.
Which I think brings us nicely to something that's a little bit more of a translation from the original source material, Geralt's storyline. There's some adapted elements from Something More, which is the last short story in Sword of Destiny. In this version, Geralt returns to Cintra 12 years after Pavetta and Duny's wedding banquet. Consequently, he's in Cintra during the siege. In the books, this is a little different. Geralt does go back to Cintra to attempt to claim his child's surprise, but this is now 6 years after. Calanthe has a slightly different method for trying to get him out. In the books, Calanthe attempts to cheat him by making him choose out of a dozen children which one is his child's surprise, which I think is very clever. And I do miss that scene in this episode specifically because I think it highlights Calanthe's cunning without making her super...
willing to sacrifice a child?
Yeah. Like, it still shows how smart and how cunning she is without her being just outright mean, I think. So that's something that I did miss from the books. But I do think that the way that it was done does make sense for the show, given Ciri's age, with a possible desire to make Geralt more of a proactive character than a reactive character.
It might also be helpful to see at least the takeover of Cintra from Geralt's perspective and have him really be there instead of just kind of seeing the army from a distance and then hearing about it, because then as a viewer you also probably feel more affected by it or you feel closer to it.
I think that also plays into Calanthe's wits and how smart she is, thinking that Geralt only thinks that the child's a boy, and that if she shows all boys, he'll just take a boy and that'll be the end of it. And she gets to keep his granddaughter, he gets a Witcher, or a boy he turned to a Witcher, and everyone wins. For this episode, I think the best part about it is that none of it was in the books, and that they needed this episode in particular to bring Ciri's new plotline and Yennefer's new plotline and Geralt's adapted plotline all together so that it all comes together for the final episode.
That is it for our show today. Elora, Josh, thank you so much for joining us for this episode, and thank you to our Hanza for listening. So is there anything that our community can help you guys with, or anything that you'd like to share with them?
The one thing I like to say is, in the beginning of the episode, we did talk about setting up the Witcher tabletop game. If we do want to set that up, I'll be more than happy to join in someone's game.
Me too.
I would absolutely love to create some sort of opportunity for everyone to meet each other and hang out. Like, I've had such a wonderful time meeting all the people in our community. I would love for people to make friends. If we get the time zones figured out, we could do it.
I need more people to talk to The Witcher about.
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
Anyway.
I'm really getting desperate because I've successfully dragged my mother into it. She's read all the books and watched the series with me and played the games with me. I've got my father to also play the games with me and watch the series, so that's pretty good. So we're getting there, but I could have more.
Yeah, I've only got one who watched the series and played the games. The rest are like, Josh, we're sick of hearing you talk about it. Talk about literally anything else.
I will sometimes just go off on a tangent where, I am just talking about The Witcher.
Yeah, I feel like for me, my coworkers know about it, so I'm like that person in the office. My dad, brother, and sister watched the series, and my sister listened to all of the audiobooks, and I tried to talk to her about it. I was like, oh, what'd you think about it? Did you like it? It was good.
Yes.
I was like, no, I was like, I need more.
Yes, absolutely. That is the conversation then.
Elora, was there anything for you that you want to share with the community?
Yeah, I could give my Instagram where I post art, sometimes often and sometimes not at all. So it's Elora Sperber, which is, you can look Elora up in the show description. That's good. Sperber is Sperber. Spelling in English.
I could tag you in like the Instagram post when it goes out too.
And I guess if anyone's an agent who's looking for a fantasy book, I am probably pitching at the point this episode comes out, so that's also good. Hit me up.
Again, thank you guys so much for joining us, and it's been such a pleasure meeting you both and having you both on the show.
Been great being here. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
So next episode, join us as we discuss the final episode of The Witcher Season 1 in our coverage of Episode 8, Much More. Thanks for joining us at the Breakfast Table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and a complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastandbeauclair.com. Breakfast and Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa with the Tidings for Toussaint music by Lars and Witcherflix. The show's edited by Alyssa with the Breakfast and Beauclair theme by Mojo Filter Media and the Tidings for Toussaint theme by Bettina Campomanes. Breakfast and Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric Scotland, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B, Julie, Sylvia of Scalia, Jameson, Ava of Gallopy, Haven of the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, Charlotte from Megaberg Lamrai, Red Kite, the original Roach, Ariel, Katie the One True Chef, Dustin, Chris K of Covier, Libby the Castle of Velis Melier, and Claire Odell. Special thanks to Elora and Josh C. for joining us for this episode, and our international Hanza for their support.